The sun hung low over the dusty town of Redstone, casting long shadows across the cracked earth of the main square. A crowd had gathered, their murmurs rising like a swarm of restless bees. At the center, tied to a splintered wooden beam, hung a young woman, her body suspended upside down, her dark hair spilling toward the dirt like spilled ink. Her name was Lila, and her crime was theft, or so they said. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but her lips pressed tight, refusing to beg. The rope bit into her ankles, and the jeers of the crowd stung worse than the coarse hemp. This was justice in Redstone, swift and brutal, meant to shame as much as punish. But as the crowd's taunts grew louder, a lone figure stepped forward, a cowboy, his hat tipped low, his boots kicking up dust with every deliberate step. He stopped beneath Lila, looked up, and said, "This ends now." His voice was low, steady, like the rumble of a distant storm, and he refused to move. Lila hadn't always been the thief they branded her. She was born in a shack on the edge of Redstone, where the wind howled through gaps in the walls and her mother's hands were always raw from scrubbing laundry for the town's wealthier folk. Lila's father had vanished before she could walk, leaving behind nothing but a battered harmonica she still carried in her pocket. Growing up, she learned to survive on scraps, literal and figurative. She was quick with her hands, nimble enough to mend clothes or swipe a loaf of bread when hunger gnawed too fiercely. By 17, she was known around town, a girl with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, too proud to let pity touch her. But pride didn't fill bellies, and when her mother fell ill last winter, the doctor's fees were more than Lila's mending could earn. She'd slipped into the general store one night, taking only what she thought her mother needed: medicine, a blanket, a tin of soup. She'd been caught before she could even leave the store, the shopkeeper's shouts echoing through the night. The trial was a formality. Redstone's mayor, a man with a mustache like a vulture's wings and a heart to match, declared her guilty without hesitation. Theft was a sin in a town where survival was a daily gamble, and the punishment was public humiliation. Hanging upside down in the square wasn't just about pain, it was about breaking the spirit, making an example for anyone else who dared step out of line. Lila's mother, too weak to leave her bed, didn't know her daughter was strung up like a trophy. Lila was glad for that, at least. As the blood rushed to her head and the crowd's insults blurred into a dull roar, she clung to one thought: she'd done what she had to do. She wasn't sorry. The cowboy's name was Elias. He wasn't from Redstone, though he'd passed through enough times to know its ways. He was a drifter, a man who carried his life in a saddlebag and his past in the lines etched around his eyes. At 30, he was older than most wanderers, with a quietness that made folks uneasy. He'd seen enough of the world to know that justice wasn't always just, and something about Lila, her defiance, maybe, or the way her hands still clutched that harmonica even as she hung there, stirred something in him. He'd been leaning against a post, watching from the edge of the crowd, when he decided he'd had enough. The mayor's men tried to wave him off, but Elias planted himself beneath the beam, arms crossed, his shadow falling over Lila like a shield. "Move along, stranger," the mayor barked, his voice sharp with authority. "She's paying for her crime." Elias didn't flinch. "What's the crime in saving a sick woman?" "You call this justice, but it looks like cruelty to me." The crowd went quiet, the air thick with tension. Lila tilted her head, trying to see the man who'd spoken. His face was half hidden by his hat, but his eyes were steady, burning with a fire she hadn't expected. She didn't know whether to trust him or fear him, but for the first time that day, hope flickered in her chest. The mayor laughed, a cold, brittle sound. "You don't get to decide what's right, cowboy. This is Redstone's law." "Then Redstone's law is wrong," Elias said. He stepped closer to the beam, his hand resting lightly on the knife at his belt. It wasn't a threat, not yet, but the gesture wasn't lost on anyone. "Cut her down, or I'll stand here till the sun burns out." The crowd shifted, murmurs rippling through them. Some agreed with Elias, their faces softening as they looked at Lila. Her youth, her desperation, her mother's illness were no secret. Others, hardened by their own struggles, saw her as a threat to the fragile order of their town. The mayor's men drew closer, hands on their pistols, but Elias didn't budge. He spoke again, this time to the crowd. "You all know what it's like to be hungry, to be scared. You've all done things you ain't proud of to survive. This girl stole to save her mama. Who here hasn't bent the rules for someone they love?" Lila's throat tightened. She wanted to shout that she didn't need his pity, that she wasn't some damsel to be saved, but the words wouldn't come. Her vision blurred, not just from the blood pooling in her head but from the sting of tears she refused to let fall. She hated how exposed she felt, how her shame was laid bare for all to see, but this stranger's words were cutting through the crowd's anger, making them question. The mayor wasn't swayed. "You're interfering with justice, Cowboy. That's a crime in itself." "Then arrest me," Elias said, his voice calm but unyielding. "But you'll have to go through me to keep her up there." Minutes stretched into an eternity. The sun climbed higher, sweat beading on Lila's forehead as the rope chafed her skin raw. Elias stood like a statue, his presence a challenge no one quite knew how to answer. The crowd began to fracture, some calling for Lila's release, others demanding Elias be dealt with. A woman, her face lined with years of toil, stepped forward. "She's just a girl," she said softly. "Her mother's dying. Let her go." A few others nodded, their voices joining hers. The tide was turning, slow but sure. The mayor's jaw tightened. He wasn't a man who liked to lose, but he could read a crowd. If he pushed too hard, he risked a riot. With a curt nod, he gestured to his men. "Cut her down." The ropes were loosened, and Lila collapsed into the dirt, gasping as the world righted itself. Elias was there in an instant, kneeling beside her, his hands gentle as he helped her sit up. "You're all right," he said, his voice softer now, meant only for her. She wanted to snap at him, to tell him she didn't need his help, but her body betrayed her, trembling as the adrenaline faded. Instead, she clutched the harmonica tighter and nodded. The crowd dispersed, some casting sympathetic glances, others muttering about troublemakers. The mayor stormed off, his pride bruised but his authority intact, for now. Elias helped Lila to her feet, ignoring the glares of the mayor's men. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said, her voice hoarse but sharp. She pulled away, standing on her own, though her legs wobbled. "Why'd you do it? You don't even know me." Elias tipped his hat back, revealing eyes that held more stories than Lila could guess. "Seen too many folks broken by towns like this. Didn't want you to be another." Lila didn't know what to say to that. She wasn't used to kindness, especially not from strangers. But as she limped back to her mother's shack, Elias walking a few steps behind, she felt something shift inside her. Not trust, not yet, but the possibility of it. Over the next few days, Lila's mother began to recover, the stolen medicine doing its work. Elias didn't leave Redstone, though he could have. He stayed at the edge of town, fixing fences and helping with odd jobs, his presence a quiet reminder of what he'd done. Lila watched him from a distance, wrestling with her pride and her gratitude. One evening, she found him by the creek, cleaning his horse's tack. She sat beside him, silent for a long moment, then pulled the harmonica from her pocket and played a halting tune, her father's song, the only piece of him she had. "You didn't have to stay," she said when the notes faded. "Didn't have to leave either," Elias replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Lila looked at him, really looked, and saw not just a cowboy but a man who'd chosen to stand for her when no one else would. "I'm not a thief," she said finally. "Not in my heart." "I know," he said simply. Word of Elias's stand spread beyond Redstone. Travelers carried the story, and soon, whispers of change stirred in nearby towns. Lila, too, found her voice. She began speaking out, not just for herself but for others who'd been judged too harshly, their stories ignored. The harmonica became her symbol, its music a call for compassion in a hard world. Elias stayed long enough to see her stand tall, then tipped his hat and rode out, his work done. Years later, when Lila was older, her hair streaked with gray, she'd tell the story to anyone who'd listen, not just of her shame, but of the stranger who'd refused to move. "He didn't save me," she'd say, her eyes bright. "He reminded me I could save myself." And in every note she played on that battered harmonica, there was a message. One person's courage can shift the world, one stand at a time. As the screen fades to black, you, the viewer, are left with a question. When the world's weight presses down, will you stand, unmoving, for what's right?